Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Michael Svetlik. I'm the Vice President of Programs here at IFES. On behalf of Bill Sweeney, who unfortunately could not be with us this morning or this afternoon, I want to welcome you and extend his greetings. We are very excited to have today's session. This last week has been an exhilarating, exciting one in Washington, D.C. with a focus on Africa and African affairs. And we're pleased to contribute in a small way to that dialogue and extend a warm welcome also to everyone watching online. IFES has been involved over the past 25 years in working in partnership with authorities, institutions, individuals, democratic stakeholders in over 135 countries. And we're very pleased in those 135 countries that we've worked in over 21 countries in sub-Saharan Africa. We're an organization that on a daily basis is very intensely involved in assisting Africa's political and democratic development. The publication that is subject of today's discussion is, of course, very timely. Across Africa, over the next 24 months, 2 years, there will be 29 scheduled nationwide elections. It's a time of increased focus on the continent, and we hope that today's discussion and our focus on the role that peaceful elections can play in political development will have positive impact. We're very pleased to have a distinguished panel, colleagues that we've worked with for many years on issues related to electoral assistance and democratic development with us. I'll turn that over to them in just a second. I hope you've had a chance to take advantage of the refreshments that we have outside, as well as the publications of fine work of our teams across the organization, and especially our Africa team is available to you out there on the table. Elections, when they're done well, and done according to international standards, have a great potential to create stability and make a positive impact on both political and economic development. And that's, I think, been clear in some of the dialogue that's been taking place over the last week. It's certainly something that I've experienced in my travels to the continent and the leaders with which I've had the opportunity to meet, especially the young leaders in the next generation. IFES has done a great deal of work in addressing the issue of peaceful elections, not only in Africa but around the world. The electoral violence mitigation efforts, the work that we've worked, the strategies we've helped develop with electoral institutions, with civil society organizations are quite extensive. And I hope we'll get into a deeper discussion today about that work and about your experience and everyone that's part of this discussion, because it's going to take, I think, all of us working together collectively to bring about what we hope are more peaceful and productive, constructive electoral and political processes in the years to come. Too often the focus is on the failed processes, the violence that may erupt, and hopefully we can begin to work together to address these. And I hope today's discussion plays a positive role in that. With that, again, welcome on behalf of Bill Sweeney, the President and CEO of IFES. We look forward to your contribution in today's discussion. I'll turn it over to my colleague, our Regional Director for Africa, Almami Sila.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you very much for coming in, and I wish to welcome all of you, adding to Michael, your participation on this one today. On behalf of IFES, welcome our colleagues, friends, and partners in the promotion and protection, advocacy for good governance elections. One of the things that I wanted to bring to your attention is that good governance, elections, human rights, they go hand in hand. You cannot separate them one from the other. In Africa, we have had quite a number of difficulties over the years, but they are wonderful difficulties because for those of us who experienced one-party states, dictatorial governments in Africa in the 70s and 80s, we are seeing competitive elections now in Africa. We are seeing people being ready to take their rightful place, and we are hoping that the various African countries will want to take their seats amongst nations of democracies around the world. For those of people who are following us online, if you have questions, you can direct them to info@ifes.org. info@ifes.org. If you have questions, please forward them there. Michael touched on why this event is timely, why the publication is timely. We all know Africa is going to be having quite a number of elections in the next in the next 2 or 3 years. There are so many elections that you find it difficult not to have maybe 10 or 15 per year. So it's very timely. And the publication also is timely, as Michael mentioned, because of the African sets of states in the U.S. and also the civil society organizations in the U.S. I was lucky to participate in quite a few of the sessions by civil society folks at the National Endowment for Democracy, and I was extremely encouraged as to how and why and the reason and the determination of these civil society folks to promote democracy in their various countries. It is timely also because I'm talking of myself as Africans and those of you who are working on Africa, we have been doing this for many, many years, and we are beginning to see at least some light at the end of the tunnel in some places. Of course, there are backtracking into others, but that should not discourage us. We should continue to do that work because that is the only way that we will have these African governments and Africa become a democratic continent, so to speak. Well, IFES's experience in Africa has been extremely important. We've worked in quite a number of countries, and we currently implement quite a number of programs around Africa. I mean, for an example, we have programs in Nigeria, Liberia, Guinea, Kenya, Burundi, just to name some of those programs that we do have on helping promote elections and democratic elections around Africa. We have the opportunity to have peaceful elections in Africa because of all your engagement and because of those civil society folks that I spoke with yesterday and the day before in promoting, who are engaged in the promotion of democracy and accountability and transparency in their own countries. If I can just give you a brief example of myself, having been an electoral commissioner myself in my home country, Sierra Leone, I tasted violence, and I knew what electoral violence can do. But even with that violence, we continued until we held elections in 1996. I was attacked. My uncle was killed during that attack. And it was difficult. I mean, I came from the U.S., went in, and I would have come back and run. In fact, I did come back to mend my broken leg, but I did go back because we were determined to move our country from a military government to a multi-party government. So I do have a taste of that, and I do know that this is something that is very critical for people to be cognizant of and find a way to address electoral violence in Africa. The publication we are putting out today actually comes from my colleagues in the field, and that is what makes it so very important for me. It is not a theoretical thing. This is things that my colleagues lived in the various countries where they work, the difficulties that they face, So it's extremely important that this publication that has 10 chapters, but at the same time, you would see a real different variety of experiences in some of these in these chapters that you will be seeing. The hard copy of the book itself will be coming out in about a month. I was advised by our Director of Communications, but we do have a USB version that will be given to all of you who are participating here today. We will be honoring the chairwoman of the Electoral Commission of Sierra Leone, who actually will be retiring this year. IFES will be honoring her with the Joe Baxter Award. For those of you who may have known IFES for a long time, you would know Joe Baxter. But for those of you who don't, Joe Baxter was one of those pioneer U.S. citizens that went to Africa to help promote electoral democracy in Africa, first in Ghana and then went to Nigeria. Unfortunately, we lost Joe, and IFES saw fit to give an award in his honor. And we are honoring Christiana Thorpe, the chairwoman of the Electoral Commission of Sierra Leone this year, with that Joe Baxter Award. So she will be coming here. And we will also be hosting a number of commissioners and commission folks from Africa during the U.S. Elections here in November. IFES has been doing that for many, many years, and we host them so they can have an experience in sharing experience on election in the U.S. and talking to their colleagues from other parts of the world. So with that, I would like to really introduce my colleagues, and I will start off with Madam Elizabeth Cote. Elizabeth and I go way back. She's a very good friend of mine. She served as our director in Guinea for many, many years, and now she is in Nepal. Elizabeth worked nationwide in Guinea, promoting democracy, Guinea-Conakry, promoting democracy and electoral democracy in that country during the hard times, during the military move, and up until the elections of 2010 and beyond, until the legislative elections. So she is vastly experienced in electoral democracy. She herself tasted quite a few threats over the years in Guinea and other places, and so she will be sharing some of those examples. So Elizabeth and I shared doing the chapter on Guinea and Sierra Leone, and so I will pass on to Elizabeth, our guru on civil society on civil society. No, Elizabeth, yes. Please.
Thank you, Almami, and hello to everybody. I'm really honored to have been invited by my former Africa team, that is my team forever, to come and speak today for the launching of this book. I think that people will have access to the book, so I won't go into detail on what really my contribution was, which was basically the role of women and youth in electoral violence, in mitigating it, and even in actually being the cause of it. And we had 2 case studies which were on Guinea and also on Sierra Leone. So when we have the discussion, perhaps if you have questions on these specific countries, especially now that Almami is here for Sierra Leone. But I will talk a little bit about some maybe quote-unquote innovative things that we had done in Guinea that were innovative then, but things evolve. With youth and women, particularly to try and prevent and mitigate violence. We were in a situation in Guinea where we were working towards presidential elections, and we were living really a polarization of 2 ethnic groups, unfortunately. There had always been polarization in Guinea, but for different reasons, and then when it becomes ethnic, it always adds a touch of bad taste in our mouths, n'est-ce pas? And So basically, the role of youth was that really we worked with youth groups, and not necessarily only, groups that were well seasoned in human rights or democracy building and all that, but they were trained in civic education, so that they could really, first of all, understand themselves, the importance of their political participation and their engagement as citizens. So we did a lot of work in citizenship to try to, create strong citizenship. And as my daughter would tell me, it would be good to do that in Canada, where I come from, and I'm sure in the States as well, because when we're working in these countries, try to engage populations in local governments and local elections and so on, and somehow maybe there's less engagement also in North America in these spheres. But basically working also with gangs in neighborhoods in Conakry, peer interventions over coffee, over tea, and that type of work, really grassroots, long-term conversations and consultations, and also codes of conduct, and that had also worked very well in Sierra Leone when the youth are really brought to really agree on making a declaration and defending it, concerts, things that also that they can relate to. And so I would say that as a tool, civic education, if there are, donors or people, who are, there's never too much civic education. And it's the term is becoming a little bit boring, but it's very exciting civic education when you go into the detail of it, especially when you're talking about engaged citizenship and the link with development in these countries. And this can be done through caravans and all sorts of means. I won't go into that. But also women, of course, have a major role because they're the mothers, they're the sisters, they're the wives, the girlfriends. They have the power of perhaps keeping their children at home instead of going out into, a bloodbath because some political party is using unemployed youth that have nothing better to do than go for these marches and so on. And so we worked a lot with women and elite women and also grassroots women of political parties, all sitting together and, also signing a declaration and a charta and, that they will convince their individual party leaders and so on for peaceful elections. All this to say that you have, when we touch the engagement at that moment, but then when push comes to shove and we're in pre-election time and everything seems to break out into chaos, and it's like if they forgot all the engagements that they have taken, both youth and women. So it's something that I think we should revisit when we reflect on programming and so on. So I spoke of civic education, and civic education, basically at IFES we tend to have to work with the state, which is important. We work with the election commissions or the ministries that are involved in organizing the elections. Our work is a lot capacity building and transferring knowledge. And we work with civil society as an institution, as a key sector of the society, trying to empower it and also try to help it become some kind of a watchdog for free and fair elections. But for that, there's also a lot of work that needs to be done to remind civil society on a daily basis how important its political neutrality is. We're talking about more NGOs. I know that civil society in America also includes political parties. But when I'm speaking of civil society, I mean more private sector, unions, NGOs, media, and sorts. And they also tend to forget everything on the eve of an election when push comes to shove. And this happened very sadly in Guinea, where we had a vibrant civil society. A lot of the leaders in the transition government went to important posts, and it was necessarily that they would lead the transition. But at the same time, they left a little bit of a weakened base that became polarized and political. So we went sort of a little bit back to square one. That was just something that I wanted to share. We also need to work with political parties. The work with political parties is extremely important, and my feeling, my experience is that we don't spend enough energy working with political parties, or we do it in a very sort of superficial manner. There needs to be capacity building and training from the militants ground up on the political game, the art of losing, and how even losing well can be their ticket to winning the next election and things like that. But that's long term, and that needs funding, and it's a very important aspect. And another thing that also I have come to realize is that an organization like ours needs to or join economic development organizations or allow for our programming to have a component of economic growth linked to our work with youth and women and whoever we're working with, because we're talking about extreme poverty, and my belief is that poverty is really at the root of all our violence on this planet, the injustice and the lack of economic power, be it religious fundamentalism or integrism, be it, kids in the street, angry, the urbanization, which in Africa, the whole traditional African family that used to convey, ethics and principles and values, traditional values, that is sort of shattered. And, when you're running around trying to feed your family, the values are sort of like a second rate. So I think that with very small funding, we could have small economic generating programs. And so you teach democratic principles, you teach civic engagement, and you have to take part in your municipal council. But at the same time, if you have a little turkey farm, you'll have you're employing or you're solvent, you have a little bit more say in political decisions. And I would just conclude also that youth is a problem that is not, in my opinion, being addressed in its full something. And youth right now, I think we're coming into 1.4 billion people under the age of 25, and I'm not sure of my numbers, but between 12 and 25, and it's exponential on the Africa continent. And some countries, like Somalia and Ethiopia, Mali even, and the DRC, I'm not talking about Somalia, the DRC is 9% of this are going to maybe find employment. And so it's a major, major problem. It can be maybe a historical opportunity for all of us to think what to do with this wealth. Or it can be a time bomb, as we see with all the, Arab Springs and all that. I mean, there was more ideology involved, so, it's a different situation. But I think that there's all sorts of creative things that can be done to address the problem of youth, but it has to be done in a concerted way. And it's done in all sorts of different ways, but it doesn't seem to be getting any better. And so I haven't really looked. I think that that's basically what I wanted to share with you. I think. Amani, thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Well, one can never overemphasize, or one can never mention enough the importance of youth and women in the current situation in Africa. I mean, when you talk about violence, it's the youth that is used to commit the violence. And who suffers? It's the women who are mothers of this youth. So you can never really overemphasize that importance. I remember when I was growing up, we were told we were the next generation leaders in my country. And now we are in our 60s. It's only now that we are getting there. But at least now we are beginning to see youth leaders really taking their rightful position in various governments. Last year, before the elections, Madam Joyce Banda, the president of Malawi, when she came here, mentioned about her cabinet, and she did have a 26-year-old minister in her cabinet. So that is very important. No, not at all, not at all. You look at the president of Malawi, the president of Mali, for an example. I was in a meeting that he was talking this morning, and when he introduced his cabinet, I think the oldest probably was 45 that was there. So you were really looking at real youthful folks. So that is the importance of it. Now, I would like to turn on to my other colleague, who is actually in the field in Kenya, Michael Yard, who actually, let me just read something about Michael. He's recognized as an international election administrator and technology expert. Technology expert. I'll give you a funny story. When we were trying to get our program in Kenya, and the Kenyan Electoral Commission was talking about IFES's work, and some UN folks went to the commission and wanted to get a program out there, and they said they have somebody who is a technology expert, and I said, well, may I ask Mr. Chairman who this technology expert is? And the chairman said, it's a gentleman, they said he's called Michael Yard. I said, huh? Well, Michael works for IFES. I can tell you that, even though he's done quite a number of consultations with the UN, but he's, in fact, at that point, he was my colleague in Uganda, going in and out. Michael Yard will be talking about his chapter, Technology and Electoral Violence, which, when you read that, you will really get into some of the real intricacies of electoral violence every step of the way, from registration through results announcement. He has worked in over 40 countries. Michael is well sought after by everybody, and I am always, trying to make sure that Michael does not leave us at all, because we love you, Michael, and any threats. So, Michael, take it over, please.
Right. Thank you, Almami. And good afternoon to everybody. I was frantically rewriting my presentation after Michael's opening remarks. Because speaking of technology, what I heard him say was that lunches have a great potential to spread peace. And so I was trying to figure out how we can fit in technologies of food preparation, when it occurred to me that what he actually said is that elections have a great potential to spread peace. So I've gone back to my original presentation here. Now, when you read through most of the literature on mitigating violence in elections, it focuses on a cognitive approach, which asks the question, appropriately so, what are the root causes of the violence? And in Kenya, these have been known, for 30 to 40 years, that the root causes of violence, post-election violence in Kenya, go back to issues on tribalism and political structures that align, political parties that really align and try to create different alliances between ethnic groups. There is a long history of land issues with the political elite and the churches grabbing land and weak laws for protection of the rights of the former landowners. There was, in general, a weak system of justice within Kenya. And then specifically related to elections, we have election systems, at least before and still to a certain extent, that really are winner-takes-all election systems. Whoever is in power in government controls all government contracts, controls all spending, and you better be my supporter if you would like a government contract. Now, that's not exclusive to Kenya. I've been away from the U.S. for a while, but I hear some of that same theme going in the U.S. Our program in Kenya was started just 1 year before, a little more than a year before the original election date. And we had a very specific focus, and there's no way we could address all of these root causes of violence. So we chose a different approach. And if you read through the literature on mitigation of violence, you'll see this as an under theme. And the approach is more of a behavioral approach, asking, okay, we know that all of these causes are there and that they need to be addressed, but we've got a timeline and an election coming up. So let's ask the question of what were the triggers of violence? What were the immediate things that preceded the outbreaks of violence that if we could address those triggers, we might be able to reduce the violent aftermath of elections. And as we read through the evaluation of the 2007 elections in Kenya that incited widespread violence, we had lots of voices, but with the same theme, that the trigger was poor management of the elections and no transparency, lack of confidence in the accuracy and the impartiality of the results reporting. So IFES assistance in Kenya focused on improved election management and procedures. And we did that across a multiple range of areas, from legal framework through training, through helping the election management body to refine procedures. But the sub-focus in this presentation are the things that we did to focus on improved implementation of election technology. Now, the known problems that we attempted to address through improved technology and improved election management were, in 2007, there was a lack of transparency in the election results. The Election Commission pretty much said, well, wait until all the votes are counted and we'll tell you later who won. We'll come back to that. There was a perceived lack of impartiality, that the government really was manipulating the outcome of the elections behind the scenes. There were a lot of obvious discrepancies and inaccuracies in the reporting of the election results. There was poor communication. The Election Commission at the time didn't do any regular press conferences. Just there was a blackout of communication. And then finally, there was a long delay in announcing the results. And when they were announced in the middle of the night, and the new president was sworn in with no opportunity for anyone to raise objections to the results that were announced. Now, those were the problems. To address those problems, we targeted assistance in 5 administrative processes that we felt could be improved through the use of technology. We looked at how we could improve the voter registration process that has been widely criticized in Kenya since 1992. We tried to address issues around election day voter identification and validation to ensure that we could keep account of how many voters actually showed up in a polling station. And then when we did the election results system, we could compare that to the actual number of voters who showed up. Again, in 2007, there were polling stations, many of them, that reported more than 140% turnout, and then still reported more votes than there were the number of voters that they reported showed up. The transmission and publication of election results was the third area that we focused on trying to improve through the implementation of technology. And then election dispute resolution. There were very weak mechanisms before for petitioning if you didn't like the process or the outcome and you didn't trust that the election was done in a credible way. There were very weak mechanisms before for filing petitions and for peaceful election dispute resolution. And we focused on helping the election management body and the judiciary to create good systems, particularly for case management, so that every case would be heard in a timely manner and the results would be published. And then finally, the issue of campaign finance tracking, and that one was one of our original goals, but was derailed by the failure of Parliament to pass a campaign finance bill. And again, that's not a problem that's unique to Kenya. They did finally pass one in December of last year. Now, because of the time limitations in this presentation, I'll deal with only two of these technologies today, and that will be the voter registration system and the results system. And I'll have to start with a disclaimer that we really faced multiple challenges in the actual implementation. You know, there's design of systems with the best of intentions, and then there's what actually happens on the ground when you're dealing with the realities of trying to implement technologies in countries with difficult political environments and lack of appropriate infrastructure. Now, some of the challenges that we faced were IEBC procurement delays, which were the result in part of a very convoluted procurement laws in Kenya. It's almost impossible to do a procurement that doesn't violate some of the procedures somewhere. And the IEBC is currently facing, some of its officers are facing charges on some of the technicalities of the procurement process, although they've not been charged with any type of personal enrichment or fraud. They're charged with failing to follow all of the technical details of procurement. Because of those technical details, there were long delays in the procurement process. There was also another obstacle, was continued political interference from the politicians. After the procurement of biometric voter registration kits failed, the cabinet stepped in and said, well, you will do biometric voter registration. It wasn't just the government party, though. Opposition parties also felt like somehow the technology would magically cure all of their problems. Just before Election Day, when it appeared that there might not be enough time to successfully implement electronic poll books for Election Day validation of voters, again, the politicians stepped in and threatened to boycott if this technology wasn't implemented. So repeatedly, the IEBC was pressured by politicians to go against the advice of their technological advisors and implement things, although there wasn't enough time to do it right. The next obstacle we faced was due to the delays in the procurements. Parliament was forced to change the law that established a timeline. There was originally a timeline of 90 days from the close of voter registration to Election Day. And there are many, many, many critical actions that have to take place in those 90 days. Without getting in and cataloging them, let me just say that when Parliament reduced that period from 90 days to 60 days, from the close of registration to Election Day, any of us who have ever been involved in elections saw huge red flags going up. We knew that this was going to be a problematic election. And then, in spite of all of those challenges, in Kenya there is an overarching inflation of expectations about what technology can accomplish. So there was widespread expectations by the politicians, by the voters, by the election managers themselves that somehow just saying words like BVR and RTS, results transmission system, just somehow talking about those technologies would magically solve many of the problems in the election. Now let's look at what happened with the technologies. We start with voter registration. Now, since 1992, every study on voter registration in Kenya has identified three recurring problems: underrepresentation of women, underrepresentation of youth, and you'll start from Almami's remarks and Elizabeth's to see this is a recurring theme throughout Africa. And the third problem was that there was no system for removing deceased persons from the register. So these were the three problems that have been identified over and over and over again. Somehow, as a result of political pressure, the voter registration technology focused on solving a problem of duplicate registrations. Biometric voter registration systems really can only address one problem, and that's attempts to register more than once. So we implemented technologies as a result of political pressures. We implemented technologies that solved a problem that nobody had complained about in the history of Kenya, while ignoring the problems which had been well documented since 1992. In spite of that, implementing voter registration technologies still can have major benefits and is right now having major benefits within Kenya. And the biggest benefit is that if we use the technology to make a more transparent and a more accessible voter registration process, and we publish the voter register widely, we make it available for the voters to scrutinize, we make it available to political parties and to civil society groups to scrutinize the register and to raise objections, that increased accountability, that increased transparency has another great side effect in that it passes responsibility for the accuracy and the comprehensiveness of the register away from the election management body and back to where it belongs. If the register is widely accessible, then it becomes the responsibility, the accuracy and comprehensiveness of the register becomes the responsibility of the voters themselves, of civil society groups who go out and look at the register and try to increase representation, of the political parties. Once the data is widely available, we can reverse that and share in a partnership on the responsibility of the accuracy and the comprehensiveness of the register. So these things came along as a byproduct of the biometric voter registration thing. And in the end, we finally did have what was widely accepted as a successful voter registration in 30 days. I've not done this study on this, but I suspect this is unprecedented, that in Kenya, IEBC in 30 days registered 14.4 million voters, and was able then to go forward and again, all of the political parties, all civil society, the media, all accepted this as a very successful voter registration exercise. However, very successful, but if I wrote an analysis today of the problems with the voter registration in Kenya, I could plagiarize the reports of 1992. Underrepresentation of women, underrepresentation of youth, and still no system in place for removing deceased. So those are the things that at this point IEBC and with IFES support is moving on to try to address these far in advance of 2017 elections. Now, the results transmission was the second technology we'll discuss today, and this came about as a result of, in 2007, the Election Commission of Kenya, ECK, refused to publish results as they were reported, and they did this for what they gave, and they considered very valid reasons. They were afraid that if people are watching and they see, okay, my candidate's ahead, no, he's behind, no, he's ahead, no, behind, this would inflame passions. Kind of like they use the analogy, it's kind of like watching a football game. You know, if you've ever seen a crowded bar during a football game, the who's ahead and who's winning and watching every move does inflame passions. Now, an analogy that didn't occur to me then, but I've used multiple times since, and those of you who have been around in other presentations in the last couple of years have probably heard this, that I wish that I had thought of this then. If you want to really inflame passions, walk into that crowded bar and unplug the television and say, just wait a while and we'll tell you later who won. If you think the way to not inflame passions is to keep the results a secret, then you've created a much bigger problem than the problem of inflamed passions. So the final publication of results, the solution was that vote counting and reporting should be as accountable as your bank account. You should have a record of every transaction, and you should be able to watch the tabulation of results as they come in from the polling station, how they're consolidated at the constituency level, and again at the county level. Every voter, every interested person should be able to look online and see the handwritten results form, and this is the ideal. We've not yet accomplished that, but we did make some significant progress towards it in Kenya in 2013, and we've made even more progress since then. This was the system that was developed in 2010 for the referendum, and it allowed Kenyans to go to bed before midnight, knowing that the referendum had passed and that Kenya had a new constitution. Unfortunately, that experience of the referendum raised expectations even higher, that somehow the technology can solve all of these problems and will do the same thing in the 2013 elections. But we had a major complication. We weren't running one football game. We were running 1,882 tournaments. The elections were at 6 different levels, 1,882 separate elections with over 12,000 candidates contesting. And we had to build systems to somehow track the results in all of those. This required a sophisticated system that tracks the data and ensures that all the candidates' names are consistent from the nominations through the final publication of results. And we built the system under the pressures of time and the shortage and the shortening of the time frames. Unfortunately, the system on March 4th and March 5th did experience some significant problems, and we only were able to report 49% of the polling station results. These problems notwithstanding, the system design works and the technology implementation works. The full system has now been implemented in 25 by-elections since March 4th of last year, and it's worked flawlessly. In fact, it's worked so well that I've had to caution the commissioners against using the word perfect, because already expectations can be way too inflated about what technology can accomplish. But at this point, we've got multiple by-elections still coming up to continue refining this so that we're very confident that that system will be in place for all future elections in Kenya. Looking at the overall evaluation of trying to improve the electoral management structures in the process, in what amounted to basically a 15-month period, Kenya was able to implement 5 major pieces of legislation, and the 6th was the campaign finance law was finally passed in December, 9 months later. There was a concerted effort of multiple institutions, new institutions that were all created after the 2007 election and after even the 2010 Constitution passed. The Election Commission redrew all electoral boundary delimitations, which is a major effort. They registered 14.4 million voters. They registered all new political parties, over 12,000 candidates, produced 1,882 unique ballots, and conducted 1,882 elections simultaneously. In the process, they introduced 3 new major technologies: the biometric voter registration, the electronic voter identification that was used on Election Day, and a results management system. They hired and trained 290 constituency election coordinators, 260,000 poll workers, and set up an integrated call center that used technology to make sure that all questions and answers were handled consistently throughout the country. And in the end, after those elections, there were 188 petitions filed. 163 of those were dismissed by the court, and only 25 of those resulted in new elections. So in retrospect, we look at this as a very problematic election and a very contentious environment, but it was, from an election management perspective, a miraculous success for them to be able to accomplish all of that in that short of amount of time. Now, takeaways from this. First, technology is a great tool, but it's not magic. It can be a really effective tool if there's a clear understanding of the problems that need to be solved and a focus on taking enough time to implement effective technological solutions. We can't overemphasize enough. This has been experienced in country after country, and Kenya is a prime example. We can't overemphasize enough the necessity for early planning, for testing on small pilot projects, for refining the technologies over subsequent uses long before you do any major implementation. Next, the technology can be one effective component in a multi-layered approach in trying to mitigate the risks of violence if it's used to promote transparency and accountability. In the Philippines, where I've also done a lot of work, there's a very common saying that the key to successful and credible elections is minimizing human involvement. That somehow seems backwards and upside down to me, but the point is that it's the human beings who conduct the elections and count the votes who try to cheat. I contend that that's backwards. The key to credible elections is maximizing the number of eyeballs on the process. And if we use technology to try to maximize the transparency of the process, then we have an effective tool. Next, technology has to be a part of a multi-layered approach that focuses not only on the immediate triggers, but on the underlying problems. And most of the rest of this publication talks about those underlying problems. And finally, these underlying problems still have to be addressed in Kenya. Among other things, the Constitution of Kenya provides a strong basis for democratic reform. It imposes integrity checks on its leaders. It tracks the sources of political finance. At least the constitutional vision is that it will track the sources of political finance so voters know who's paying for these candidates who are on the ballot. It establishes quotas for women's seats in elected bodies. It ensures the representation of persons with disabilities. It protects the freedom of the press. It devolves power away from a national government down to the counties with the goal of increased local control of government resources. And it guarantees the independence of the election management body. These are some great goals that are all enshrined in the Constitution of Kenya. The election of 2013 reflected progress in towards many of these goals. Unfortunately, it eroded others. In the next few years, we try it again in 2017, and in the intervening time, IFES continues to support IEBC on refining the election technologies, but we're also working to implement those technologies in an environment that increasingly realizes the democratic reforms envisioned in the Constitution. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you very much. From Michael's points, you can see that we come a long way in Kenya. Is it perfect? No. But are we getting there? Slowly, to show elections real processes. I remember in 1997, I was in Kenya when they had legislative elections. And I was working with civil society, and what was interesting was that the results of the elections were announced And I think it's 2 days later, President Arap Moi appointed the chairman of the Electoral Commission to be the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So that meant every other election dispute will have to come to the same person who had just been the chairman of the Electoral Commission. So we come a long way. In Guinea, in '97 also, where election results were changed midway from one constituency, one guy who won the elections, everybody was dancing in his constituency, which we monitored actually. And when the results were announced in Palais de Peuple in Conakry, the guy who lost became the winner. People did not go to the streets, but now people are taking difficult positions in making sure that elections really reflects the will of the people. We've come a long way. We still have a long way to go. Our next speaker, ladies and gentlemen, wow, Gabrielle Bardal. She's a Trudeau Foundation scholar and researcher. Gabrielle is an academic and an electoral assistant expert with a decade of experience supporting electoral processes in transitional states. Very important for us. She has worked in more than 25 countries with international organizations, including the United Nations Development Programme, UN Women, UN Department of Peacebuilding Operations, the International Foundation for Electoral Systems. Actually was part of the Africa team. Bardal is a doctoral candidate at the University of Montreal, where her research explores democratization and electoral violence in sub-Saharan Africa. She holds a BA from McGill University in Montreal and an MA from the Institut d'études politiques in Paris. She is 2012 Trudeau Scholar and an expert-level facilitator with the Building Resources for Democracy, Governance and Elections, which we simply call BRIDGE. As a specialist with UNDP and UN Women in New York headquarters and in county offices, she has contributed to several cutting-edge publications on enhancing women's political participation. With IFES, her research on gender and electoral violence pioneered the study of the field during the post-revolution elections in Egypt in 2011 and 2012. She became the first gender expert to be deployed on the core team of Carter Center Observation Mission, bringing women's exclusion to the forefront of mission priorities. Ladies and gentlemen, Gabrielle Bardal.
Thank you, Almami, for the kind introduction, and to the Africa team for having me back, my old family here at IFES, as well as to IFES and to the Trudeau Foundation for making my participation here possible today. Grenades, armed attacks on polling stations, violent protests, murder, Twitter, Facebook, SMS, character assassination, intimidation, systematic harassment, sexual assault, domestic abuse. These are the many faces of election violence today in Africa and beyond. Crude and destructive, as it often is, election violence is also equally subtle and complex. It's part of a very rapidly changing field. The field of electoral management has professionalized over the past 20 years thanks to contributions of election management bodies around the world, as well as assistance organizations such as IFES. The professionalization of the field comes in response to a growing complexity in emerging democracies today. The era of first-generation elections is over. With very few exceptions, the great dictators of the post-colonial times have given way to a new generation of African political classes. For most African citizens, the spectacular brutality of the Mobutus, the Idi Amins, the raging civil wars, they're no longer the most pressing threats today. Instead, and here I agree with Elizabeth, the unrealized promise of a democratic dividend is casting a shadow and is driving the ongoing violence that surrounds so many elections in Africa today. So where is this democratic dividend falling short? How does it contribute to election violence? Democratization is not a linear process. There are rapid openings. There are very dramatic successes. There are equally dramatic setbacks that happen. I would argue that there's also a very dramatic status quo that's developing today. That is the persistence and the stability of states that are caught between democracy and authoritarianism. These hybrid states have democratic processes and they have institutions of democracy, such as elections and parliament, but they violate the principles of freedom and fairness so profoundly and systematically that elections are no longer instruments of democracy. They can become tools of authoritarian control. These hybrid regimes are the new norm. With very few exceptions, almost all African states today fall into this murky gray zone that's somewhere between democracy and authoritarianism. And it's this dangerous state of limbo that is at the heart of much of the election violence that we witness today. We here in the democracy assistance community, we need to be aware of these dynamics and we need to stay ahead of the curve. Understanding the dynamics of these regimes is vital to understanding why they're so prone to election violence today. It's vital to understanding how to break the cycle and how to support these states in moving forward on a path to democratization. It's for this reason that IFES's new publication is really particularly significant today. So what's going on in these countries? In 2006, I spent 4 days hiding in a closet in Kinshasa while opposing political factions shelled our neighborhood after refusing to accept the results of the election. A pretty spectacular failure of the art of losing, as Elizabeth called it. Although those elections in 2006, which were at the time the largest international assistance for an electoral program in history to date, although those elections were technically free and fair, mistrust ran so deep between the parties. The parties were still very close to their roots as armed rebel groups, and they were much too close to their guns and to their artillery shells. The bonds of accountability and responsiveness to constituents were not yet established. And the prize, the control over Congo's vast mineral resources, raised the stakes very high. The roots of violence went way back into the electoral cycle in this case. They were in the development and the education of political parties, which I can't stress enough, the faith in the rule of law that existed in the country, the failure of the demobilization process, and in the electoral dispute resolution mechanisms that existed. Meanwhile, across the border, another form of election violence was fomenting in tiny Burundi. In this case, the stage was set years before voters ever went to the polls. Although the first post-conflict elections in 2005 were deemed successful, the violence, the corruption, the manipulation of the legal framework, the human rights abuses in the intervening years, including the assassination of IFES's partners working on anti-corruption work, my colleagues, was so profound that when the 2010 election rolled around, the opposition parties were in a bind. The elections were still the only game in town at that point, but the playing field was so deeply skewed that there was no reasonable hope of competing fairly. They were faced with a really difficult paradox, which is not unique in this country. This paradox, how do you compete in a non-competitive environment? Their response in that case was to boycott the elections in a context of intensifying violence. And while those elections were also technically free and fair, the basis of democracy was profoundly undermined. There was no competition. Election violence in this case was also a long-term phenomenon, staged years ahead of Election Day. Now, I've spent the past few years, since I've left my friends here at IFES, talking with women politicians and voters in these hybrid states around the world about the challenges that they face when election time comes around. To them, election violence has a totally different face from the bombs in Kinshasa and the boycotts in Bujumbura. The violence they experience doesn't make headlines. It is not in election observation reports yet. Soon, we hope. But it's equally widespread, and it's really just as crippling. African women candidates, voters, elected officials, they experience a completely different type of election violence. Much of it is psychological, threats against their family, their bodies, their children, their reputations in their community, their personal dignity even. Some of it is sexual, which is not something we think about when we talk about election violence. This violence takes place in public spaces, as in Guinea, when security officials rape dozens of women during the breakup of a political rally. It also takes place in private, in cases of domestic violence, where we have documented male family members seeking to prevent, to coerce, to punish women's political participation in various levels. Some of it even takes place online in systematic character defamation attacks and vicious attacks with weapons of mass destruction, like Photoshop, which is a big one. From sexual harassment of women MPs on the floor of Parliament in Nigeria to assaults on women members of electoral management bodies and women poll workers just for being women. This is a really devastating form of election violence that's too often overlooked. So if we don't recognize the types of violence that are out there, we can't prevent them. And the stakes are higher now than they ever have been in the past. During first elections, hopes and confidence run high. But it's during the second, the third, the fourth elections that momentum starts to falter. Democratically elected leaders use less than democratic means to retain power, which creates disillusionment and, in many cases, election violence, even with systems that appear on the surface to be democracies. The tools of electoral malpractice are also increasingly sophisticated today on both sides of the aisle, not only with incumbencies but also with opposition groups. Gone are the days of crudely stuffing ballot boxes. It's about image, perception, creating public legitimacy. Often these things are just as sought after, if not more sought after, than the ballots themselves. Indeed, we've seen examples of cases where political parties are stuffing the ballot boxes, but not with their own ballots. They're stuffing the opponents' ballots into the boxes so that then they can go to the international observation groups and say, look, hey, they cheated. It's sophisticated, and it's about a lot of things, votes as well as perception. Sometimes election violence also follows similar patterns, committing terrible acts of violence against innocents to blacken the image of a political opponent. We saw this in the case of Burundi in 2010 when the nature of election violence changed dramatically. As soon as the boycott took place, violence became very anonymous, grenade attacks, attacks to create terror, so that both political parties could point the finger at each other. Very difficult to identify a perpetrator in those cases. These are the complex faces of election violence in Africa today. Acts of election violence occur throughout the electoral cycle, and the causes are often rooted in the hybrid nature of the state itself. While violence is never acceptable, it can be rational. And understanding its causes, its manifestations, its patterns are keys to addressing the problem. The good news is that solutions are evolving equally rapidly through a dedicated community worldwide and are being applied throughout the electoral cycle. National actors, including election management bodies, civil society groups, women's organizations, are taking the lead in offering innovative solutions, many of which are addressed in the pages of IFES's new publication. International actors are also moving ahead. IFES has been an absolute pioneer in this field. For over a decade now, the EVER project, the Election Violence Education and Resolution Project, has contributed to mitigating election violence in over a dozen countries. Today is getting even more sophisticated as well with the integration of technology solutions. And IFES's work in documenting and researching different areas of this have also been groundbreaking. Other organizations as well are introducing exceptional resources, including International Ideas Electoral Risk Management Tool being used in Kenya and Nigeria, USAID's Electoral Security Framework, and the UN agencies, which have also produced a number of knowledge projects in this area. IFES's newest publication that we're launching here today is a valuable resource. It looks at the many complex faces of election violence in Africa today, and it breaks them down to understand what is happening, why, when, where, and who. It tackles the question from many perspectives, which reflects the complexity of the issue today. And most importantly, it offers a real wealth of examples of how to move forward in preventing and mitigating this type of violence. From media to civic groups, political parties, technology solutions, it gives a real glimpse of the complexity and of the problem, but as well as the solution. And it also gives a special focus on how election management body organizations and the organizations that support them can contribute to enhancing transparency and accountability of the electoral process, which is also often at the base of the dissatisfaction leading to violence. It's an excellent resource for practitioners working to break through at all points of the electoral cycle. I was very happy to have an opportunity to read it in great depth, and I'm privileged to be here to support the launch of this great resource today. So congratulations to all of you that worked on this project, and thank you again for having me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gabrielle. The role of the electoral management bodies, Gabrielle mentioned that Michael touched on in terms of the what the IEBC is doing is extremely important in Africa. And I think that is one of the areas where IFES has been really strong in advocating for independent electoral commissions. I think we are moving in the right direction, and I think the African governments are taking note of that to be making sure that these commissions are truly independent. We hope in the next few years we'll really get true independent electoral commissions around Africa. Now, I think I will pass it on to the audience to ask questions, and those online, info@ifes.org, and my colleagues will be passing mics in case you have questions, please. Okay. The young lady there, yes. And the gentleman right behind after the lady. Right here. No, to your left there, sorry. That's right. I'm so sorry.
Okay, hi everybody. I am Bernadette Ipe. I come from Mali. I'm in Washington as Young African Leader. I'm here for the Washington Fellowship of Obama. And I'm in IRI. Institute, International Republican Institute. I have a question about Mali because, Mali was the best example on democracy in Africa. But after the crisis, now we can say that we are the one of the bad example about democracy because we have a lot of problem about democracy. My question is that during your intervention, you say that IFES work with youth, civil society in different countries, but I didn't hear something about Mali. If you work with Mali and civil society, do you work strange with your organization or with NGO? Because I'm in youth organization. We help children, women, and we did a lot of work around election during the election in 2030. And we are working with NGO in Mali, but it is not American United States NGO. So my question is, how can we work with you for democracy, good governance? That's my question. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Hussein Abdel Salam. I'm a human rights researcher from Egypt. I have a general question. What we are noticing, at least in some areas, that there are so the elections are free, but they are not fair in the sense that election laws that are applied by the state are actually discouraging because they can only produce one result that benefits government parties. So we are finding, for example, that youth are dissuaded from joining elections. So as civil society, what should we do about this? Should we focus more on advocacy, or is it worth it to encourage people to go to elections that will only add legitimacy to a flawed system?
Thank you. My name is Mindy Reiser. I've had the privilege of being an election observer in Macedonia and in Armenia, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are when a certain segment of the population, a religious segment, shall we say, decides to boycott the election because they feel that the candidates simply haven't taken their needs into account. That means that for a certain percentage of the population, the election has no legitimacy. How does one try to react to that after the fact? Ideally before, but when these deeds are done, what do you do?
Elizabeth, do you want to take any of those?
Yes, I could just discuss maybe about the role of that civil society I would say that the possibilities within civil society, in my opinion, are limitless. Especially in advocacy and being some kind of a watchdog, but to push also push policies, but they have to really be engaged, and it's not necessarily an elite urban civil society. It has to be a movement. And I think when a movement reaches a certain importance, this is, of course, and it has to be done in a subtle fashion, that it's not an immediate threat, so closed down by the regime in power and so on. But it really has to work intelligently to promote change, basically the change that is at hand. And, this is what I can advise. And it varies a lot depending on what type of regime is in place and what is the situation on the ground. But it has to be resilient and, not decide that it's not worth fighting for elections. I think that you always need to fight for free and fair elections. It's my opinion. I don't know if I'm answering your question.
With the young lady, it is so befitting that you raised this question, because one of the chapters in the publication is on Mali. And the gentleman who heads our Mali program is here, who wrote that article. And he is our director in Mali, and he does work with civil society people. And I will ask my colleague, Sidi Jawara, to please. Sidi, the lady wants to know if we can if we do work with civil society in Mali, and please help us out.
Thank you, Almami. Indeed, we work with civil society groups in Mali, and one of the things we try to expand on is our contribution to peaceful environment, because when we started the program back in 2011, I would say just a few months after we started the program, the crisis broke. Within 3 days, our entire plan was totally, I would say, destroyed, because a coup took place. And what we saw in Mali, it's not even about the crisis in the north. The coup d'etat created a new sort of polarization of the Malian society, because we had, in one hand, some civil society groups supporting the coup, and other groups opposing the coup and calling for a civilian government, or even to bring back the deposed government. And every evening on the national television, we'll see a list of new associations or even existing associations coming on the national TV, reading support messages for the military junta. That was something unprecedented in Mali. In any case, what we tried to do with in expanding our program was to put in a peace-building component. And there was a new group, just to name a few, a group set up by a journalist originally from the northern Mali. He created a group called Cri de Coeur in order to support the peace effort and also humanitarian assistance in the north. So we gave the group sub-grants to go advocate for peace, and also to try to bring all the other groups, northern groups, together to discuss peace in the interest of democracy, liberal democracy in Mali. And they are still doing it. And the rest of civil society organizations, we try to expand on the content of the civic education. So wherever they work, peace, security, the need for democratic election is embedded in the messaging, in the regular face-to-face civic education sessions. So it's a combination. Initially, civic education had nothing to do with the crisis, with peace building or violence. But as the situation brutally changed, we had to adapt our messages. And that's what we did. We continue to do so. There are other organizations doing purely peace building, not necessarily involved in electoral or civic voters education, but they have also gotten involved. And I would say mainly the message during election was we need peaceful elections. No political party is worth dying for, but probably Mali peace is worth dying for. So if you don't die for peace, don't die because you want a political party to win elections. So that's the message we're still trying to get across in Mali. I hope this gives some insights. Yeah.
Gabrielle, please.
Thank you. The two questions regarding what to do when you believe elections are contributing to a flawed system, to an authoritarian system, and the question of boycotting. These are fascinating questions, and they're major concerns around the world today, in Africa in particular. I'm speaking here as an independent researcher, and we do recognize that this is going on around the world, and I would argue that much of it goes back to the standards that we use in defining what a democracy is, and also in measuring how we approach elections. Elections are necessary to democracy, but they are insufficient to create a democracy. And we need to keep that constantly in the forefront of our mind. Much of this goes back to the definitions again. Are we using a minimal or a procedural definition of democracy today, which really relies on just an electoral process? Or are we looking for more substantive things? And I think you'll see that, especially in the academic literature and more as it's starting to connect with the practitioner world, this notion of substantive democracy is really being developed and put into action in further ways in terms of concepts of electoral malpractice, research on electoral integrity. How are we measuring these things? The standards for elections hold, obviously, but how do we measure more fluid things, as in civil liberties, human rights, and this type of thing? These are challenges that we need to be aware of. The logic of boycott, obviously, is to look at a system and say, this election we do not believe will be competitive, and it may contribute to making the situation worse. Therefore, we're gonna step out of it and withdraw ourselves. And it's really a problem because it's winner, it's all or nothing. Either they do succeed and create some type of power sharing agreement, or bring it to the international community's attention to such a degree that the incumbent no longer has the authority to continue to control, which is, of course, the objective of the opposition groups that are participating in the boycott, or they absolutely lose out. And I think you'll see today, if you talk to the opposition parties in Burundi, they regret that decision to boycott in 2010 because it set the process back 10 years or further. They have no voice whatsoever in what's going on in the government today, and there's been sweeping reform in the country that has set the other elements of substantive democracy even further back: human rights, civil liberties, and this and that. So, having some participation is better than no participation whatsoever, I would say. But you can't equate elections with democracy, quite simply. So.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. I'm Leon Weintraub from the University of Wisconsin. I'd like to ask about some of your discussion of electoral violence. I'm wondering if, in your discussions with people who do indulge in violence, if some of their reaction is due to what seems to be a winner-take-all system, whereas if you lose the presidency, for example, you don't really have competing centers of power, such as an independent legislature or judiciary, or independent possible alternate center of power out in the provinces, out in the regions. So people feel we've got to win this one. Of course, if not, there's nothing left. There's no alternate competing source of power, either in public life or in the private sector, which is often dependent on government licensing or permits. I'm wondering, this does go a little bit beyond the capabilities of IFES, but I'm wondering if the system is somehow contributing to violence, because it seems to be to either an all or nothing.
I'm really sorry, I have a plane to catch, but there's one thing that I just wanted to say before maybe addressing your question is that the polarization a little bit of the planet, if you look at it in a macro, of course in Africa maybe there's in some countries less ideology-based polarization, but it seems to me everything is a little bit becoming 50-50 right now. And just to touch at what, and I'm glad to hear, what academia is doing, because unfortunately when we're in the field we don't have time to read anything that's going on, so it's always good for us to resource ourselves when we meet researchers. But the fact that it's 50-50, and when it's sort of the, sort of obscurantism vs more open society type of thing. It can be religious or it can be, Democrat, Republican. It can be all sorts of things. And when you have like a Hamas winning in Palestine, for instance, a free and fair PACA election, but all of a sudden we're not too happy with those results. So where do these free and fair election quests, reside? So we have to work a little bit more in the field of maybe promoting what an open society can bring. But again, it's a luxury. It's an economic luxury in a way, this open society. I'm coming back again to the poverty because I think that the peace is really relying on less economic injustice. And I think it's boiling over because of this. And I'm too distracted to answer your specific question. I really have to rush out. So thank you very much, everybody. You'll answer. I'm sure she'll answer much better than me. No.
Yes.
Thank you. I'm from Zimbabwe, so my questions will lean towards that. I've got rather two comments. The first one being about technology. In as much as, yes, we're advancing in technology and systems are becoming more transparent, but just as thieves become cleverer in disarming alarm systems, so do governments become cleverer in, rigging, but, with the facade of it being transparent and free and fair. And it becomes even harder to contest that election result when they say that, oh, look, we had all these technological advancements. For example, you've got international companies, I know at Nikuvo, it's in Malawi and Zimbabwe, and they've come in and spoiled ballot papers and so forth. And you have the opposition parties, one, lack the technology to contest or challenge those discrepancies. They don't have the resources and so forth. So that's relating to the technology. Then the second one is violence. Can we escape? I kind of feel that sometimes violence is a bit necessary. I'm a human rights activist, but you find in situations whereby there have been deaths, bloodshed, that's when the international community wakes up and says, oh, let's intervene, let's put pressure on these governments. And then, for example, Kenya, that's when they had the government national unity. Zimbabwe, they had the government of national unity. But the last election, 2007, when there was no violence, the government stepped up. They said, okay, no, we won't, harass people physically, abuse people. We'll just do it in a clever way. And the international community says, oh, they're free and fair. Or rather, there's not much incentive to interfere or intervene. And most of these African countries actually got their independence through violence. So can you really run away from, taking the axe and going out there and physically fighting for your political rights?
Michael, you want to take that, please? Michael?
Yeah. Yes. Actually, can I ask you to repeat the question? I'm having a bit of trouble hearing the audience speakers.
That's in relation to technology. It wasn't really a question, but rather a comment. How best can you help opposition parties, not opposition parties, but just generally governments and systems to, in as much as you are advancing in technology in helping the system become more transparent, fighting, the voters' role and so forth, but governments who want to stay in power are even more eager to stay in power, and hence they import ways in which they mess with the election system technologically, and you have the companies such as Nikuv or international companies that come in that have far much more advanced technology than the man on the ground, the opposition party who's from the village and so forth, who can't contest. So as you have advanced technology which legitimizes the election, so technology is also used in help in circumventing, the justice of the election system. I hope that was a bit clearer.
Okay, yes, and I do recognize that the reality of elections is that those who are in power want to stay in power, and those who aren't want to take power. And free and fair elections is really secondary, usually or often to those who are contesting for power. Now, in terms of what can we do to help those who are I appreciate you tried to phrase it this way, that you started by asking how can we help the opposition, but then clarified that what you really mean, and it is the case, that very often the government has much greater resources than the opposition. And so what can we do to help those, and even using technology, what can we do to help those who have less power and less resources available to them? And for this is a recurring theme for me over 20 years, is that the only legitimate use of technology in elections, if we start looking at how can we use technology to be more efficient, then we've completely missed the purpose of elections and how we should use technology. The technology in elections is only legitimate when it's used to increase transparency and accountability. So we should be trying to implement technologies that give as much information as possible to everybody equally. And information then, to a certain extent, is the great equalizer. So we start with things, as I said, voter registration systems. The value of technology in a voter registration system, for me, is to the extent that it makes the register more accessible to political players and civil societies to scrutinize, to see who really is included and who's excluded from the register. If it makes it more efficient, well, that's secondary. If it makes it more transparent and makes the information more broadly available, then we've accomplished something. Likewise, saying that we use technology to only to give credibility to flawed elections, again, if the technology is implemented correctly, it provides the same information and the same level of transparency to all parties. And if the elections are in some way flawed, the technology implemented correctly gives evidence to losing parties to take to court and to file petitions and to have clear evidence to overturn the results of the election. Now, as far as the results technology, I've only seen it really fully implemented in a handful of places where you can actually see everything from the handwritten results forms that are signed by all of the party agents, all the way up tabulated to the results at every different level. When we can implement the technology that successfully, where we give that degree of transparency, yes, the technology does give credibility to the elections, but it gives credibility because it gives a level of transparency and accountability so that everybody in the country can see for themselves, was this vote count accurate? Was it reported with integrity, or was this flawed? And if it's flawed, it gives that same information to everybody as well. So the goal for us in trying to implement good, effective results systems isn't to give perfect results, it's to give transparent results. So the results, and we saw this in Kenya, that some of the constituencies had math errors. And there was a big deal made out of this. You know, look, there are errors in the results. Well, that's the good and bad of transparency. There are always errors, math errors. Every election I've ever worked in, there are math errors. A good transparent system shows those math errors so that everyone can look and make sure, okay, would those errors have affected the outcome? Would any manipulation of results, it should be immediately available so that we can use that to petition to overturn the elections. So I'm not sure that there's no perfect answer to your question. Technology can be an equalizing force, but it's always competing against forces that don't want that type of equality and widespread voice.
Thank you, Michael. We'll take two more questions. The gentleman at the back and this gentleman here. Oh, we have online. Okay, we have online questions. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. And I'm sure everybody will agree with me that political parties that win elections are the ones expected to form elections, right? But if the internal structures and the internal governance of the political parties in general are, one, undemocratic, two, not transparent, not responsive or responsible to their members, so it is very unreasonable for us to expect that party, when they win election, acquire power, access the money, and expect them to be democratic. So I will suggest, and if IFES is not doing that already, that they should begin the democratization process from the stage when the political parties are trying to form themselves and trying to access to power. You either support them, give them technical support, guide them as to how to refine their processes to be democratic, responsive, and accountable, or find a way to rate them so by the time they come to power, you know exactly what you expect of them. So that's one key area I will expect IFES to consider, or any other institution that support democratic development in Africa. We always go to the tail end. We need to start from the beginning. Thank you.
I'm from Kenya, and I must say I don't know whether to ask for more time, because I sat here and in more than one way felt described through and through. I'm a doctor by training. I'm a pediatrician, and I've been in civil society. I worked in the university where I started trade unions in the university. I was in private practice. Then I went into government. I was the director of medical services, the equivalent of Surgeon General, and then a permanent secretary. And now I'm a politician and a member of parliament, and I'm in the opposition, and our party lost. So, and he was describing what happened in Kenya, and I was part of it. So, let's start with the principles. I think more from what he said and what the lady said. There is a lack of understanding that I see in the basic issues in the continent. One, parties to a large extent in Africa are ethnic. To a large extent are ethnic. And that goes beyond age and youth. Even the youth join parties in an ethnic way. And then that follows what she said, that unrealized dividends of democracy and poverty. And what he said, that people realize that if their parties lose, in reality is the ethnic groups that lose and feel left out. And the passion that generates is huge. However, you bring solutions, and many of these solutions that IFES come with, to a large extent, do not take into consideration the basic facts that are driving the passion and the emotion. Technology will never beat mankind. It's brought by mankind, and she's very right. You can actually manipulate technology. The understanding of technology in Africa is perhaps as good as here. except maybe in the invention and the manufacturing of it. And so that we look at the basic issues of democracy at the time, even when the parties are being formed. Can we really make them national parties that aspire to the well-being of the nation as a whole and not to the well-being of groups? This is made worse by the fact of youth unemployment, which is all over the country, making available a very energetic group that can be used as fodder in violence or as mobilizers even in a flawed election. Now, therein lies the problem. Now, let's come to the solutions. The incumbents have a lot in their favor. And in Kenya, there's a question I've never understood because this was a problem, and I'll ask Michael there. There was a feeling, and I'll just say that the voter registration, 14 million in 30 days, we also thought it was miraculous, but we were happy with it. The biometric voter registration, that was it. Then the biometric voter identification. Michael, it failed. 10 o'clock, I went to the polling stations and all the computers were not working in my constituency. And we went to manual. That's what happened. And then when we come to the result transmission, I think we used more of the mobile phones to transmit the information. Now the tallying, then when it reached there again, it was now in computerized form. But you say there was a problem with with the math and so on. But there's a question that I've never known whether it was true or not. There was a feeling that the server system that was being used by the IBC belonged to the same company that was also used for tallying by the party, the incumbent party that won. That has always brought suspicion. Maybe Michael today, far away this side, I may get a clearer information whether that was true, and it goes to say the lady from Malawi was saying that it can be manipulated at that level. And so I really think that when you look at democracy and elections and free and fair, remember it is a perception. It may be actually free and fair, but if it is perceived not to be so, you will still have violence. It is the perception. So I think we need to go a lot deeper. And then I say there is a feeling, and as I see here, I was also feeling a little bit uneasy because age-wise, I think maybe me and you, and maybe you are the rest are relatively young people. And there's this perception that things will be changed through the youth to the exclusion of the other people. But what we miss out in that is that systems involve everybody. So by the time you start to devolve the system, I don't think it worked in Egypt. There was a gentleman here from Egypt. What has happened? It has gone all round, and the military has gone back with the same age group. So I know I'm going to take a lot of time, I see, but mine is, I think, let's look at the basic issues in the continent and try to address them. The inequity and the structure of political parties, and when we bring technology, it must be in the basis of that. I might ask Michael again, that single server issue, please today, could you give me a little more clarification?
Thank you. Is this on? Okay. Okay, I'd like to propose a question from our colleagues online. Actually, a former colleague of ours from IFES, Leslie Richards. She says, I'd like to thank the speakers for their great insights and personal experiences. My question for all of the panelists is, do you believe that peace and stability should be one of the Millennium Development Goals? The lack of peace and stability affects states achieving any of the development goals
because once the state is in conflict, resources are diverted from development.
All right. Thank you very much. I took note of the various questions, and I'll just try to address them briefly. Regarding the internal structure of political parties, this is absolutely a big issue. I would say that there's two approaches to it. First of all, looking at what is going on within the parties themselves, and second of all, the rules that describe their activities and regulate their activities. IFES, and my colleagues from IFES will talk about this more, has its areas of specialization within electoral assistance, and other organizations specialize in areas such as political party development as well. And these groups of organizations form the community of democracy assistance. So this work is being undertaken. In terms of who is left out of electoral processes, it's not shocking research, but research does prove that the people who lose elections tend to be the people who are least happy with democracy as a whole. And certainly there needs to be work in learning to deal with this. What is the art of losing? Quotas help in some cases in ensuring that there's some level of representativity in terms of ethnic quotas in Burundi, gender quotas in many African countries. But these quota systems also have their problems, and they can also become very sophisticated tools, as you mentioned, being used by non-democratic leaders. Also looking at the origins of political parties, many of them in particular in Africa are former rebel groups, and with their own logic and their own very undemocratic structures. And so any work on political parties needs to look at the origins of these groups as well, and work on how to build them out. And the question regarding perception, yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. The perception of democracy is as important as democracy in many cases, because it's trust in a system, it's legitimacy. It's the feeling that your beliefs are being represented by your leaders. And if the belief is there and the confidence is there, that's a major step forward, which we need to keep in perspective. Regarding, there was a question about electoral systems and decentralization in terms of spaces of influence. Alternate spaces of influence are equally important in terms of soft spaces, the media, spaces for debate. Again, with political parties, I've worked with political parties who, in trying to organize a campaign period electoral debate, said, no, I'm not going to tell my platform now during a debate. I'll tell you my platform after I've won. And those are important spaces of dialogue and power, but we can't minimize the importance of the hard spaces, the elected positions at all levels. And there are examples across the continent of where decentralization programs have worked in that regard, but others where it's failed pretty dramatically. Regarding useful violence, you mentioned that violence is used by parties sometimes to raise the profile of what's going on in the country, because only when there's spectacular violence that gets covered by international media does the international community step in. That's our fault. We need to be more sensitive to that type of provocative behavior, and be involved earlier in the electoral cycle to avoid letting things get to that end. We also need to be really critical about how we're defining who's doing what. You said, there's sometimes a reasons for violence. It's a violence against a regime that's basically authoritarian. So the people who are making the violence aren't necessarily just bad guys. They might have democratic goals underneath the violence. It's not black and white. But you also can't assume that opposition parties are democratic just for the virtue of being opposition. So we need to be critical in both of those regards. And then finally, in terms of peace and stability as an MDG, bonjour Leslie, it's nice to hear you are watching us. The Millennium Development Goals, soon to be the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, absolutely need to take these types of bigger questions, I think, into perspective. We can't go on with the very simple minimalist measures that we use to define many of these Millennium Development Goals in the past, and so I think conversations like this are an important part of constructing those. So I think that was the list. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriel. Michael, reaction and final thoughts?
Yeah, and I'll to my friend from Kenya, I would welcome a chance when you're back in Kenya to sit down and talk with you through some of these. And your opening remarks about trying to build national parties, we're in complete agreement on how to improve the internal democracy of the parties, help them focus on issues and not on ethnic division. On the question on the biometric success or failure, the biometric validation of voters is something completely different from biometric voter registration. And this is a common confusion in Kenya. People say that because the second one failed, the biometric validation of voters on election day, then biometric voter registration was a failure. Biometric validation of voters is only done, that I know of, in 2 countries in Africa, Ghana and Kenya. Both did it for the first time last year, and both of them had problems doing it. However, countries throughout the world for 20 years have been doing biometric voter registration without trying to validate on election day, and that's been widely successful, as it was in Kenya. So the biometric voter registration, again, that equipment worked almost flawlessly after the first couple of days. I'm still not a major fan of biometrics, but it worked in Kenya. The biometric validation on election day had major failures to a great extent because of interventions of politicians insisting that it be done against the advice of technological advisors and in spite of all delays in the procurement. So they insisted it be done. It failed. That really should not be a big surprise to anybody. It failed long before the procurement was ever finished. The last thing I just try to do, because I think this has broader implications, is there was this expose done on KTN TV in Kenya that purported to examine a question about whether the election results system might have been hacked. And the answer, part of the evidence that they showed were some call logs, not call logs, some database logs that they showed Kincall, who also had a contract with one of the political parties, and they showed database logs showing that Kincall was also responsible for the databases that did electronic results transmission. Now, in that same expose, they interviewed experts who looked at the 2 call logs and said, well, wait, this Kincall one, this is an Oracle call log. The electronic results system is SQL Server. Anybody could have made this up and doctored it, and they didn't even do a very good job in creating the evidence. So the KTN broadcast debunked their own theory and then came back in conclusion and said, these questions still remain. Well, in reality, no, these questions don't remain. They were answered very definitively, but that's not the answer that the producers of the documentary wanted to portray, and so they ignored their own experts. Now, the problem with increased transparency is just that. Increased transparency, you can always find and you can always even invent evidence. And so it's really important that we develop ways to scrutinize, but also we've got to develop the sophistication of the political parties and their own technological scrutineers to make sure that when they're looking at evidence, if the evidence is ridiculous, they call it ridiculous. And that's exactly what happened in the documentary. They looked at the evidence, the experts said, this is ridiculous, and then they came back to it later and said, these questions still remain. So in any case, I would invite you, I would love to have a chance to sit down with you and discuss this further when you're back in Kenya. I think we'll have much more common ground, particularly looking at future democratic reform in Kenya, than we will any differences of opinion. I would love a chance to meet with you when you're back.
Thank you, Michael. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. And Michael, if I can make a recommendation to you as well, I had a lengthy discussion with Maina Kiai the last 2 days, and I would hope that I did recommend that when he gets back to get in touch with you. So I hope you will meet with him. My take, ladies and gentlemen, is that sure, the parties are difficult in Africa. Sure, elections are never perfect. People say elections does not democracy make, which is true. But one cannot have democracy without elections. That is also true. So how do we try to help these countries to move from one area to the other? Political parties, Mr. Jesmet Suma, I am just reminded of what Julius Nyerere had said when he was being pushed to get multi-party systems and democracy in Tanzania. And Julius Nyerere responded, "You always talk about democracy with no Democrats. They only talk democracy when they are in the opposition, but when they get to government, they do the worst thing." So I think organizations working on that issue, I think we should get in touch with. Michael already touched on results transmission, so no reason for me to go there. But in terms of peace and stability, I think it is the responsibility of African governments and the political parties, and of course, particularly civil society, to be able to make sure that their leaders are accountable to them. I thank you very much, and I wish to thank my colleagues on the communications team, Danielle and her team, for putting this together, and my colleagues on the Africa team. And on behalf of IFES, I thank you very much for participating.